On today's Prophecy in the News, we're going to continue a study that we began on our last program on the subject of Obama. According to our article, our cover story for December, President-elect Barack Obama is related to President Bush. They are 10th cousins linked by Samuel Hinckley, who lived back around 1662. Now, we have discussed on our last program this at some length. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me as we continue this study of his royal roots linked to President Bush and to all 60 royal families of Europe. And then, of course, we discussed Michelle Obama's cousin, who is one of the leading black rabbis in America, and then his chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel. Gary Stearman is here to discuss Obama's roots.
Indeed. Rahm Emanuel, who, by the way, is a Jew with connections to Israel today, his parents, very highly connected. His father, a war hero in the Irgun. Rahm Emanuel is someone who would be predisposed to be favorable toward developments in Israel. We don't know exactly how that's going to play out yet, but all these questions that we started to discuss last week, and we're going to continue on today's program, bring up a field of inquiry, let's call it that, JR, in which we're going to deal with a question that's on the lips of many Christians today. Is Barack Obama the Antichrist, or to be considered a candidate for same? Now, JR, we're very, very quick to say that we're not naming Barack Obama as the Antichrist. In some sense, we want to try to put to rest that question.
Yes. Well, I'm not sure that we can completely put it to rest, but I can tell you this. His name does not add up to 666 in Hebrew. Okay? So, you know, however else you might feel about him one way or the other, he is not, as far as we know now, the candidate for the Antichrist. We're still looking. There's somebody out there whose name does add up to 666. But Google Trends, a first-hand account by having access to the log files for a site on page 1 in Google for the term "a disturbing massive surge in traffic for the keyword Antichrist" is being reported. A Google spokesman said, "Take it for what it's worth, but this is a problem that we have never seen in politics to this extent before." Wow. And so we talked about, you know, people are thinking, could this be?
So they're going to Google and typing in Antichrist to see what the Bible might say about it.
To see what the computer
or to see if the computer draws any link at all between Barack Obama and the term Antichrist.
Well, there are a lot of people out there blogging on it, writing about it. Right. Now, he is kin to President Bush and the royal bloodline. And in this article that we have, by the way, in our December edition of Prophecy in the News magazine, we talk about George Bush's relationship with all the royalty of Europe, including the Habsburg dynasty, who ruled the Holy Roman Empire. So, you know, President Bush, for all his failures or failings, he was kin to all the royalty of Europe, which, by the way, most presidents who have been president of the United States over the past 200-some years, from George Washington, who was kin to the English throne, right down to the President-elect Barack Obama, are kin to European royalty. Now, European royalty, understand, goes back to Merovee in the Merovingian dynasty, who claimed roots from the Trojans. And the Trojans, of course, are related to the Spartans, whom Homer's Iliad calls the Danaans. So this is our connection back, as we study history, back to the tribe of Dan. And of course, according to the Britam.org website, Judaism expects a Messiah whose father is from the lineage of David and Solomon and whose mother is from the tribe of Dan. Israeli author Yair Davadi writes, quote, "A midrash states that Solomon the legendary judge hero, had a Danite father and a mother from Judah, whereas the future Messiah will have a father from Judah and a mother from Dan. This is in a midrash called Genesis Rabbah, chapter 98, verse 13. And so we have successfully seen Obama's Danite roots to European royalty, but what about his father and his African lineage? This is what we want to discuss today.
Indeed. Now, why are we getting so excited about lineage, about genealogy? Well, for one thing, the Bible deals with genealogy. As we mentioned on our last broadcast, J.R., the Bible has genealogy after genealogy, and Daniel chapter 11 is devoted to the genealogy from Alexander the Great down through the Ptolemies and the Seleucids all the way to the Antichrist. So if the Bible is concerned with those genealogies, we should be just as well concerned. And that's why we're doing what we're doing here. J.R. last week mentioned a book called Ancestors of American Presidents, showing how all the American presidents are interrelated, and some of their roots go back to European royalty. And he has just mentioned how Jewish expectation is for a figure, a ruling figure, to come out of a certain genealogy. J.R., we now have come to a period in history where we're able to look microscopically at the human genome,
yes,
and begin to trace roots in a way that we could never do it before. And that really adds a lot of interest to this whole story.
Beginning in the year 2000, when the Human Genome Project finally finished mapping DNA, then certain DNA archaeologists began to look for tracing the migration of humanity from their roots. And it has been fascinating because it proves what Genesis says, what the book of Genesis says, that three groups from the Middle East begin to disperse throughout the world. And also, they can follow Jewish trailings. Well, this takes us, of course, having decided that his mother comes from Danite roots. His father, then, is the big question, because his father was Muslim and his stepfather was Muslim. However, Kenya is located on the east coast of Africa, with Ethiopia to the north and Zimbabwe to the south. And Gary, the Ethiopian Jews, it's been proven, they now live, most of them live in Israel now. They've been rescued and brought to Israel, the black Jews of Ethiopia, that Solomon and the Queen of Sheba married and produced a son by the name of Menelik. Also, we must remember that Solomon's mother was Bathsheba. Bathsheba meaning house of Sheba. So it's entirely possible that Solomon's mother was also of Ethiopian origin.
Now, there's a paragraph in J.R.'s article that deals with mitochondrial DNA from the female side of a genealogical line, and the Y chromosome DNA from the father's side. And I want to just simply read this. This is fascinating. Genetic anthropology is conducted using Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA, two segments that have unique properties that facilitate studies of multi-generational inheritance. Y chromosome DNA is passed only from father to son. Similarly, mitochondrial DNA is passed only from the mother to her offspring. In addition, both accumulate changes at predictable rate, producing genetic breadcrumbs, quote unquote, that make it possible to follow these markers as a population moved around the globe. Now, over in the area of Africa, where you're talking about, they have observed what's called the Cohen modal haplotype.
Yes.
Cohen, C-O-H-E-N. And of course, that's a Jewish word for high priest, or for a priestly member of the tribe of Levi.
Yes.
The Cohen modal haplotype, then, would be a genetic marker for the tribe of Levi.
And so we have two tribes listed as the roots of many of the black tribes of Eastern Africa. So there's Ethiopia to the north, Kenya in the middle, and Zimbabwe to the south, and the Lemba tribe. I want you to notice what we have stated here about the Lemba tribe. In this article, it has been proven through DNA that the Lemba tribe of Zimbabwe is descended from King Solomon and the tribe of Judah. And so we have the Ethiopian Jews, and we have the Zimbabwe Jews, and Kenya right in the middle as they moved in. So in other words, it's very possible that many of the people living in Kenya have Jewish roots. We don't know. We don't know yet whether Barack Obama's grandmother and her son, his father, have Jewish roots. But it's entirely possible because they live right there on the trail between the two countries, you see, where the black Jews are located.
Well, now let's follow the discussion of our study on Barack Obama's genealogy into a little bit different direction. According to the Times of London, about 8,000 Bedouins living in the Galilee are claiming a U.S. President-elect Barack Obama as a lost member of their tribe. Now, Bedouins, yes. J.R., Arab Bedouins.
Yes, Palestinians. Claim to be Syrians, as a matter of fact.
Now, they would track back to Abraham through Ishmael or perhaps through Keturah, Abraham's wife that yes. by which he bore other children. But J.R., that's an entirely different genealogical line, nevertheless very interesting. Bedouins are excitedly claiming that they now have a man in the White House who is a distant relative.
Abdul Rahman Sheikh Abdullah told the Times that they've withheld the claims until now so as not to intervene in the election campaign. He said, quote, "We knew about it years ago, but we were afraid to talk about it because we didn't want to influence the election." He says that back in the 1930s, under the British mandate for Palestine, some of the Ethiopian, or some of the Jews, some of the black members of Kenya came up to work in northern Galilee and married one of the girls from his tribe, took her back to Africa, and from them then came the grandmother and the father and Obama.
And apparently the 95-year-old mother of the man that J.R. just quoted noticed a trait, a facial resemblance to the offspring of this particular tribe. The genealogy, really, the mingling of two peoples, Kenyans and Bedouin stock that then migrated back into Eastern Africa. And she looked at the facial features of Barack Obama and said, he looks just like my people, which started a search, and apparently they believe they have documentation.
Yeah, they've got the documentation. They haven't come forward with it yet, but they plan to, according to this article. And so out here in our magazine for December. And he also says, we hope to God that Obama will solve the problems that beset the Palestinian people. So they're looking to him to come and put this all together. Isn't that amazing?
It is.
So we've got some high hopes for President-elect Barack Obama. The history of the Middle East, I have written, is littered with the stories of false messiahs and the brief followings. For the time being, Sheikh Abdullah is greeting a dozen respectful visitors a day, basking in the reflected glory of what would be not only the first African-American U.S. president, but the first one who could claim kinship with the entire clan of Bedouin.
You know, expectations would be high. If seen from the perspective of people living in the Middle East, we mentioned possible Jewish roots. His chief of staff is a very highly placed and very strongly genetic Jew with ties to Judaism, with ties to Palestinian groups, tribes. the expectations placed on Barack Obama are over the top. They
Yes.
look upon this man as somebody who's going to solve the problem at last.
Yeah, now you got to understand that if there was no second coming of Jesus expected, if Jesus wasn't going to come for another 250 years, if the Bible was a concoction of ancient tribes sitting around the campfires, if the Bible is filled with fairy tales, and if the Bible is not true, then you can understand how Barack Obama could solve the problems of the Middle East. He would be the man of the hour if we didn't know that Jesus had predicted the movement of a world government system, an antichrist system, to establish mankind on a one world footing so that all would be brothers around the world. And it's, in other words, it sounds, humanly speaking, it sounds wonderful. But Jesus says that the devil is behind it all.
Absolutely, and there are really two major prophecies in the Bible. One is for a great series of latter-day wars, and the other is for a global government led by a single man. Now, J.R., nothing could be clearer than those two basic latter-day prophecies, which we have believed and taught for a long time. And you have to put Barack Obama and the people he has chosen around him into this mix, because, J.R., we're seeing the rise of that great global government right now.
Yeah, now comes this very interesting little verse of Scripture from Revelation chapter 2 and verse 13. To the letter at Pergamos, the Lord writes, I know thy works, and where thou dwellest, even where Satan's seat is. Satan's seat, or throne. What does this mean? Well, let's go back in history about 150 years BC, before the birth of Christ. We come to a king who lived in Pergamos, or sometimes called Pergamum, and his name was Eumenes II, king of Pergamos. And he built an altar to the god Zeus. That same altar that is described in the book of Revelation, that looked high, of a pavilion high on the hill above Pergamos, called the altar of Zeus, here called the seat of Satan. And so the Lord Jesus called Zeus Satan. And he said, I know where you live. You live where Satan's throne is. Well, in the 1880s, German archaeologists went to Pergamos and dug up this great altar of Zeus and took it back to Berlin and put it in a museum. They built the museum, and here's a picture of it right here in our December issue of Prophecy in the News magazine. Around this pavilion is a fresco of statues out of marble depicting the battle of the giants. That would be Zeus, who was head of the Olympians, fighting against his father Kronos, who headed up the Titans of ancient Greek mythology. But this mythology had its roots in history. We go back to Genesis chapter 6, where the sons of God saw the daughters of men. And so we have this big battle where Zeus becomes the king. You know, Satan himself takes over from Kronos.
And what we've got is a civil war in heaven, out of which emerged this single powerful leader, J.R., of historic proportions. The Greeks believed in him and they worshipped him, Zeus. This altar of Zeus must be, I don't know what, 250 feet across, maybe 50 feet high. It's huge. And the Germans simply took it apart block by block. They marked every block. They reassembled it like a giant puzzle back in, guess where? Berlin, just before the rise of
You want to know where Satan's seat is today? It's not Pergamos. It's Berlin. How about that?
Yeah.
Now, Adolf Hitler rose to power in the 1930s, and he was so enamored by this altar of Zeus that he had a replica built, an outdoor arena in the replica of this altar of Zeus, where he stood and gave his mesmerizing speeches blaming the Jews for everything. And It led, of course, to the Holocaust and the murder of 6 million Jews. And so Adolf Hitler stood before the altar of Zeus. You know, right at the place where the throne was, the seat of Satan itself. And Adolf Hitler used it for his many speeches. And we've seen a video of Hitler, you know, and all the people with their Heil Hitler hand raised. Well, Barack Obama went to Berlin to make his speech on foreign policy, and he stood there at the Brandenburg Gate and gave his speech to 100,000 plus people. One of the announcers on German television said, "You have just heard from the next president of the United States and the future president of the world." That's what he said.
He did. And J.R., we must remember Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Back in the old days, he and Eumenes shared something.
Yes.
They shared this idea of Zeus worship. In fact, when Antiochus IV Epiphanes invaded the temple, he had a statue of himself as Zeus put in the holy place of the Jewish temple.
Yes.
And he was the prototype for the man who shall come, who shall also be a worshiper of Zeus. That's the tie between this altar of Zeus past and the altar of Zeus present. J.R.,
yes.
That altar of Zeus is an important backdrop.
Yes, so now we come to the acceptance speech of Barack Obama in that huge football stadium in Denver, Colorado, with 100,000 people there. And his backdrop, you guessed it, was the altar of Zeus. Now, there is a man by the name of Joel Richardson, gained in some instant notoriety across the internet by demonstrating that this building was a dead ringer for the great altar of Zeus who once stood above the city of Pergamum. The Obama people made some weak excuses that it represented the U.S. Capitol and the White House West Wing combined, but expert scholars agree with Richardson that it was a replica of the great altar of Pergamus. So, curiously, Obama chose to deliver his rousing political coming-out speech to the assembled, mostly youthful masses from a replica of the throne of Satan, just as Adolf Hitler did many years ago. This is bizarre. We don't know what to make of it, except we know that Jesus is coming soon. That's really exciting, isn't it, Gary?
J.R., it is exciting. We're watching. In fact, join us on our next broadcast, because we're going to get into a discussion about what it is exactly to watch for the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. We are emboldened to be watchful and not to shrink back and be bashful about it. The Bible instructs us always to keep our watch, to keep looking. And we do this. And when we see little signs emerging, as we do now, political, global, the economy, politics, we watch these little things coming together and coalescing. It encourages us as premillennial, pre-tribulational watchers for the Lord to really get back into the Word and look, because, folks, He's coming.
Yes. And the cabinet that Barack Obama is gathering around him may have a lot to do with world politics in the days to come. Hillary Clinton being the Secretary of State, and they are vetting past President Bill Clinton for the possibility of being a roving ambassador, an envoy to the nations, to the troubled spots of the world. I'll tell you, boy, things are heating up for this world as we look for the soon coming of Jesus Christ. So keep your eyes on the skies. This is J.R. Church and Gary Stearman. Until next time, keep looking up.